and he'll introduce our program. Thank you.
Thank you for that roaring clapping. I really appreciate it. Thank you. No, stop. Thank you. John Cavell, it's great to be back. I was here on the Hill for 12 years, so whenever there was red, hot, and blue, I would always show up. So I appreciate all the happy faces. And we really have a story of hope today, which is kind of exciting for us because many times when we talk about the environment and we talk about conservation, we're talking about the threats and we're talking about what's wrong. Well, today we're going to be able to tell a story about what's right and the hope that we have for the future. Many of you, if you haven't had a chance to look at the articles that were in the New York Times over the last several days, we've had some great coverage of this amazing rediscovery. But from our perspective, the Wildlife Conservation Society was founded in 1895 with the help of President Teddy Roosevelt. Most of us know the Wildlife Conservation Society as the Bronx Zoo. We set up the Bronx Zoo in New York in 1899, and from the Bronx Zoo, we sent out our first groups of explorers, really, to explore the world as early as 1897, 1903. So we have a long, long history of conservation and working on the ground. And it's really an honor for me to have with me my colleague, Dr. John Robinson, who's going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we've been doing in Sudan and why this is important. And then after that, we're going to ask Mike Fay and Paul Elkin, and I know many of you know who Mike is, but we're going to ask Mike and Paul. Paul runs our Southern Sudan program, to say a few words. But Dr. Robinson first.
Thanks, John. In the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the New York Zoological Society was about the only organization supporting field conservation. One of the programs that supported was a survey of Sudan in the 1970s. And a fellow called John Frixell went across, did some initial ground surveys, did some aerial surveys, and basically brought back the word that the South Sudan, which was this great, vast savanna ecosystem, was one of the great wildlife spectacles in the world. And that news was just beginning to become visible within the community. When war broke out, the South Sudan Liberation Army began fighting for independence from the north. And the outbreak of hostilities really stopped conservation activities, stopped the visibility of the outside world in South Sudan. In 2007, WCS now, we changed our name, went back into South Sudan. And our expectation was that the wildlife would have been largely lost. 20-odd years of war in the rural countryside. And as you'll hear today, that wildlife survived. Not only did it survive, but it flourished. And in many ways, that is a credit to the South Sudan Liberation Front, the Army, all the work that they were doing in the South Sudan. But one of the things that they really held on to was the wildlife, and wildlife became an important part of the struggle. People harvested wildlife, but the wildlife was harvested in a sustainable way. And so you'll be hearing today about really a discovery or rediscovery of something that we thought was lost. We really think that wildlife in South Sudan provides a way to foster the future of conservation in South Sudan. It has huge impacts on management, diversity. It has impacts on economic development in the area. And I think you'll be thrilled by the story you'll hear today. So, Mike.
As Mike and Paul, if you can start making your way up, that would be great. Mike Fay, who in the audience doesn't know who Mike Fay is? Okay, a couple of us. Mike Fay is a Wildlife Conservation Society scientist and explorer. Mike is also a National Geographic Society explorer in residence. And he a couple of years ago decided to walk across Africa. And he'll tell you a little bit about that. But the fact is that he has been a stalwart supporter of this work. And Paul Elkin is another one of our very, very senior scientists who ran our programs for the Congo Basin Forest Partnership in Brazzaville, and now has moved to Southern Sudan. So, Mike and Paul, it's your show.
Thanks, John. I'm probably the last person to ask who I am. That's for sure. I've spent a lot of time in airplanes in the last 3 or 4 years, flying very, very low over most of the continent of Africa, from south to north, east to west, looking at landscapes, looking at the relationship between human beings and everything else that exists in nature. And what I have seen over most of the continent is that today most wildlife is restricted to protected areas. In the vast majority of countries around Africa, wildlife is restricted to protected areas, except for the very large forest block of Central Africa. One of the big kind of holes in the data set up until very recently was Southern Sudan. And we knew from the data that we had that in the early 1980s, wildlife like no one had ever seen before, except perhaps in the Serengeti, was present over much of southern Sudan. And in fact, someone, as John mentioned, John Fryxell did a study in the southeastern part of the country in 1981 and discovered almost 800,000 or around 800,000 white-eared cob, just over, I guess, 860,000, I think. And you think 20 years of warfare, this gigantic question mark, you know, what's left? And there were white rhino there were black rhino, there were tens of thousands of elephants in southern Sudan back in the 80s. There were probably 100,000 buffalo and who knows how many antelope, but probably well over 1.5 million antelope. One of the largest migrations of wildlife on the planet. So if you can imagine, just a few months ago, we were flying into Sudan for the first time with our airplane, flying at 300 feet above the ground. And we flew in from Kenya. We were about 20 minutes in, and boom, there we see our first antelope. It was a Grant's gazelle. And I'd never even seen a Grant's gazelle from the air before, and I thought, you know, there's something. Because in a lot of places in Africa today, you can fly for hours, you don't see a single animal. Flew a little bit farther, we saw a giraffe. Flew a little bit farther, we saw a few more Grant's gazelles. But then we got to Boma, where we were going to base ourselves, and we didn't see anything else. And we did a big loop around the park, and we didn't see anything. And so we thought, not much left, perhaps. Then we started on the flight, and we tried to replicate exactly what Fryxell had done in 1981. We had a map. It was kind of like following a treasure map, you know, that someone gives you, because it's old kind of photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy that we kind of geo-referenced and put in our GIS, and we were able to follow those flight lines. And what he did was fly at 300 feet above the ground in a Cessna and fly transects that were separated by 10 kilometers apiece. So we did the first transect, didn't see anything. Second transect, don't see anything. Third transect, very little. And we hit the fourth transect, and you've got these observers in the back of the airplane, and all of a sudden somebody yells out, "White-eared cob, a 1." And you think, ooh, good, white-eared cob. That was the species that they had found in hundreds of thousands in Boma National Park back in the 80s. And then it was white-eared cob 5, white-eared cob 10, white-eared cob 50, white-eared cob 100, white-eared cob, and very quickly it was impossible to count the number of animals streaming under the airplane. And I've been, like I said, all over Africa and a lot of other places, including over the northern slope of Alaska. I have never, ever, ever in my life even imagined that wildlife could be that dense, let alone seeing it. I just couldn't believe my eyes. Thousands and thousands and thousands of cob running underneath the airplane. And you think you're hallucinating. And we weren't taking drugs at all. And so we loop down, we take the next transect, and we hit them again. And we're 10 kilometers south. You know, that's a long way, 10 kilometers. And we're hitting thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them again. And we loop around and we hit, and transect after transect after transect after transect, this place was just infested with white-eared cob. And, you know, you start counting them kind of just by looking out and thinking, okay, that's about 1,000. But then there's another 1,000 there, there's another 1,000 there, there's another, and you just, you wonder how animals can get that dense on any landscape, you know. So at the end of the day, and Paul's going to talk about, you know, the overall scientific result of the study, but what we determined was that southeastern Sudan has retained a wildlife migration in the 21st century that may be the largest migration of large mammals on the planet. Wow, that's amazing. The only one that competes is the Serengeti, and we're determined to beat the Serengeti at this point, because we do believe that there are more mammals there than in Tanzania and Masai Mara. So, you know, you kind of think, well, so what, you know? But I think as we've seen in Darfur, the exhaustion of the natural resource base, and I believe that is the cause of a lot of the conflict in Darfur, people become desperate and they start to do things that people who face abundance in nature don't do. And I think that southern Sudan, as it emerges as a nation, has a great opportunity to manage its natural resources and have a very long and prosperous future using those resources sustainably. And if you think about 1.3 million animals on a landscape, if they took 100,000 or 200,000 of those animals out every year, you could produce that many animals every year for the rest of time. Whereas if you go to the Central African Republic today, as opposed to 1980, when they had similar numbers, there's almost nothing left. And people in eastern CAR are today very desperate, and what we're seeing is people from Darfur covering that landscape with a lot of insecurity and a lot of just human suffering. So I'm going to let Paul show you the results. But I do believe that the U.S. Congress has to, and I say it every time I come here, the U.S. Congress definitely has to think more about, in their foreign ops, that everyone on Earth lives off the land. And we can't escape that. And if we don't think about that and don't invest in taking care of the natural resource base of the planet, we're going to see Darfurs popping up all over the place very soon. Thank you.
Good morning, afternoon. As Mike mentioned, southern Sudan has historically been known for its wildlife riches. And the surveys in the 70s and the 80s demonstrated and informed the development of strategies for protected area management, and also a growing even tourism trade in the early 80s. It was known for its migrations, but also it held important populations of elephants, lions, giraffe, and even rhino, both species, black and white rhino. While wildlife was particularly the rhino, under threat even before the war broke out. Clearly, wildlife resources were very important to the authorities of southern Sudan in the early 80s as an economic development tool. And the footage that you'll hopefully see as the video rolls ahead was shot in the 1980s in the Boma National Park area over towards the floodplains of the Sud. And these migrations, you have both the white-eared cob moving down from Boma, and this is the Tiang antelope from the Jonglei area. WCS, then the New York Zoological Society, supported the directed studies of Frixell, which on the ecology of the white-eared cob, which helped inform the authorities to create the Boma National Park. When war broke out, wildlife activities and conservation research was suspended. It wasn't until 2001, 2002 that General Akwach, Malik Marjan, Luka Pota, and others of the New Sudan Wildlife Society, supported by USAID, undertook ground surveys. And they confirmed the continued existence of the migration, continued persistence of elephant populations, but of course, ground surveys were unable to quantify and cover the area necessary, and they recommended that aerial surveys be undertaken. So starting in January 2007 this year, we embarked on a systematic survey repeating the methods. The surveys were supported by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Society, USAID, and WCS. Mike for the plane, as he always does very well. We had a front seat observer collecting the data, and two rear seat observers, Malik Marjan and Lindsay, who collected and systematically called out each and every observation made of wildlife, livestock, and human activities as we passed over the landscape. These are each observation is registered in a computer. It's georeferenced with a GPS, which then is developed into a database, which is both quantitative and allows extrapolation to calculate numbers of species across the landscape, but also spatial, so that you can really see the spatial relationship between livestock, human activity, and wildlife. And you can see the tracks of the plane in black, each and every line. And now we'll switch to the PowerPoint, which will show you our overall survey effort. It took us some 35 days, nearly 2 months, and 150 hours of flying. And we covered an area of we sampled an area of 150,000 square kilometers, which is roughly 1/4 of the territory of southern Sudan. So you can see the track of the airplane in the black lines, and the 3 blocks are on the right, the left, your other left, the eastern border. On the border with Ethiopia, you have Boma National Park. It's the light blue block, moving over to the Jonglei region and the Sud swamps in the north, and Southern National Park over here in the west. And what we found was truly stunning. And what General Akwach and Malik had been telling us was indeed true. The migrations were continuing. And when we started doing the systematic survey, as Mike said, we just couldn't believe it. And you think, how can you possibly count how many animals are in this photograph as you're flying 150 kilometers an hour across this landscape? Very difficult, so we feel we've underestimated, our methods underestimated it. Tiang as well, they're larger bodied, a bit more visible, but also thundering in great numbers across these plains. And this is an area which, of course, has known conflict over the past 22 years. The small Mangala gazelle was also found moving in large numbers. And when you compare these statistics from the surveys from the 1980s with our fresh data from 2007, you can see that our white-eared cob estimate is nearly the same. It's some 800,000, and that's an estimate. The Tiang numbers, while in the mid-range, are similar to surveys which are done at that time of the year, 160,000, way back in 1980. Mangala gazelles seem to have increased. So we have this massive movement, and they're moving together across these plains, and an estimated number of 1.2 million animals in an area which has known conflict and suffering. Elephant. To our great joy and surprise, elephant numbers were very high in the Sud. higher than they were surveyed in the 1980s. It seems the elephant found some refuge. People moved out of the Sud. It was a very conflicted area, but they have found some refuge in the swamps. Elephant numbers also in Boma National Park were up towards 1,000, which is a very important population. So the findings on elephant were not good at all for west of the Nile, and particularly Southern National Park, which once boasted 10,000 elephants some 25 years ago. We only saw one group, and that's where Mike described earlier. We have a factor of horsemen coming down from the north, systematically down into Southern National Park, into DRC, into eastern CAR, and decimating the wildlife base for ivory meat and bringing it back into the northern Darfur regions. Buffalo also in Southern National Park, nearly, they seem to have seen apocalyptic declines. However, in the Sud, 8,000 buffalo are thriving. In Boma National Park, greatly reduced, but still present. We think that the more sedentary species, like buffalo, and in some areas giraffe, hartebeest, they were more easily hunted and obviously don't move and range out like the white-eared cob and tiang do, and so they suffered greatly in some areas, but still in numbers which can recover. This is a photograph was taken around 40 kilometers from Juba, the capital of Southern Sudan, to the east, a group of 32 giraffes. Oryx are still occurring in large numbers in Boma and the southern semi-arid areas. As I mentioned, hartebeests have known local declines in Boma National Park, but are in numbers that can recover. Zebra, we didn't see any zebra throughout the survey. In fact, this group of zebra is the only group of zebra that we saw during 200 hours of flying effort. So something happened, something serious happened to these zebra populations. But the hope, this group, for us, when I see this slide, this represents great hope for the Southern Sudan wildlife base. They're still there. We systematically surveyed and registered human activity, of course, traditional villages and industry. Lion populations seem to be doing reasonably well in Jongole, and we heard them in Boma, but of course ground surveys will be necessary to truly assess lion populations. Ostrich, many areas. Eland seem to be doing well in Boma National Park. The good news from Southern National Park down in the southwest is that the giant eland still exists in reasonable numbers, and they're endangered throughout much of their range over towards CAR and Chad. So Sudan has both species of eland to conserve in its resource base. This is a shot of the Sud, the Nile River. Important numbers of shoebill stork, an endangered species. Of course, a lot of human activity, fishing villages throughout the Sud. The Nile leshwe, only found in southern Sudan and only found in the Sud. We found them in thousands. Of course, also to the north, we have human villages. All human activity is most easily analyzed through spatial databasing and getting an idea of where the people are in relation to the wildlife, as well as road development and the returning people, returning IDPs. Livestock calculations showed very high numbers for cattle in Jongole, and this is going to be an important issue to manage, grazing and water access rights in relation to wildlife needs. That figure in Boma is twice the figure that was estimated by our colleague Friggsell some 20 years ago. By far, the greatest impact which was visible on the landscape was a systematic dissection of the Sud swamps through oil exploration and exploitation activities. That's a high priority that we're working on with the government of Southern Sudan to put in place policies and regulations to monitor and reduce the impact of the oil industry, which is important for the development of the country, obviously. Road development is going to be a big issue. As the country develops itself, we're going to have sound planning, environmental impact assessments to reduce the impact on wildlife populations. IDPs are moving back, displaced peoples, both refugees and internally displaced, are moving back. This is in the Jongole. You can see the impact they're having on the land, as Mike mentioned. Local communities feel the impact. They live directly off the land, and putting in place sound land use management processes is going to be key to both preventing and managing conflict between communities, but also conserving the habitats. Fire management is important. Of course, poaching is is assisted by automatic weapons. There are automatic weapons throughout southern Sudan. There's an arms recovery program. There's a demobilization program. But elephant poaching is on the rise. You have commercial meat hunting in some areas, and automatic weapons are used. For the most part, traditional, there's a bushmeat coming out of Boma National Park. For the most part, people report that traditional hunting tools like spears are no longer used. But on 2 occasions, or 3, we cited people hunting down the white-eared cob with traditional means, with spears. And we feel that working with the local communities and building on these very strong traditions and tradition of conservation and management which exist with the different communities, that can be a tool to enhance and promote conservation practices in post-conflict southern Sudan. This is a map showing all wildlife. The green splotches are each and every wildlife observation which we made in relation to human activity in the landscape. And you can see the direct negative correlation, in particular in the Boma block to the west, that is just filled with people and cattle. And there's no wildlife in there. And then as soon as the people drop off, there's wildlife. With the exception of the rule is Southern National Park here on the right, where you have very limited human activity, but the park seems to be empty in many areas, and that's what we attribute to the horsemen coming down from the north seasonally, as they've done over the past decades. So this information is informing a strategic planning process. The government of Southern Sudan and Wildlife Conservation Society signed cooperation agreements in March 2007 to put in place, to develop and implement a wildlife protected area and natural resource management strategy as a critical component of the nation-building process of Southern Sudan. Key elements of this will be an overall assessment of the protected area network through continued surveys, both aerial and ground, socioeconomic research, and updating our knowledge base to inform management planning and wildlife management schemes, setting policies and priorities for protected area management planning, the creation of new protected areas, the regazettements of others, piloting ecotourism in the Boma National Park, which is here on the border, and also developing a model land use management program in the Boma Jungle landscape, which is some 200,000 square kilometers, which includes park protected areas, which includes multiple use zones, extractive industries, and also the successful land use management program in this landscape will secure for the long term these wildlife migrations. Clearly, the potential for ecotourism in national parks is there. Infrastructure needs to be developed, and wildlife populations need to recover, but the proximity to Kenya makes it very, very realistic that we can already start piloting ecotourism in the coming years. Community-based natural resource management programs, conflict management and resolution programs over natural resources, and also alternative livelihoods, alternatives to commercial poaching, commercial hunting are going to be key components. Linking the Wildlife Protection Initiative with the demobilization process and arms recovery programs are key components linked to, which will also enhance the security for local peoples and security situation in general in southern Sudan. The Ministry of Environment, Wildlife Conservation and Tourism has already embarked on a program to reintegrate and train former SPLA soldiers into the wildlife forces. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of extractive industries such as oil, mining, and logging are an important area for both the development of policies and regulations, but also monitoring for the government of Southern Sudan so that it can balance its development objectives and revenue generation needs with the environmental conservation. And as Mike pointed out, for us and the team who undertook the surveys and our colleagues from the government of Southern Sudan, who you'll hear from soon, this represents a great rediscovery and a great find, but also hope for the people and wildlife of Southern Sudan.
It gives me great pleasure to quickly introduce to you the delegation that is here from Southern Sudan, because this is truly a partnership between the global conservation community and the government of Southern Sudan. The Minister for Presidential Affairs, Dr. Luca Byong-Deng, the Minister of Environment, Wildlife Conservation and Tourism, Lieutenant General Lauro Cericio, the Undersecretary for Ministry of Regional Cooperation, Dr. Shirino Hiteng, the Undersecretary for Ministry of Environment, Wildlife Conservation and Tourism, Major General Alfred Akwach, the head of mission here in the United States, and one day we will call him our ambassador, Mr. Ezekiel Gatquath, and Executive Secretary for the mission here, Ms. Jahan Mikach Deng, and the Congressional Affairs Representative, David Choate. It gives me great pleasure. We should give him a hand. In a moment, the minister will share a few thoughts and an expression from the government of Southern Sudan, but we're very, very honored to have with us the chair of the Africa Subcommittee, someone who I've, in my past life, called my leader. He has really been a force to be reckoned with on the question of Sudan. It's a great honor, Congressman Chairman Donald Payne.
Thank you very much, John. And it's really good to see that your work continues. And let me just certainly say it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. First of all, to welcome our guests from Southern Sudan and the officials, and of course our representatives here in Washington, D.C., representing the government of Southern Sudan. But also to see the level of interest that is exhibited by so many of you being here, showing that there is a true interest in conservation and this new great discovery. I think that the slide certainly told it all, that the staggering numbers of 1.3 million animals, gazelles and antelope and 8,000 elephants, all rediscovered, really bodes well for the future of South Sudan. We know that conflicts have really devastated animal populations in other parts of Africa, the DRC and Mozambique, but we're very pleased that we have seen that animals have certainly survived here because, as you know, in civil war and problems of conflict, animals are inadvertently killed by combatants. They are, people sometimes are forced to have alternative ways to feed themselves, and as we mentioned many times, animals are killed just getting in between combatants. We also, of course, know that they're still poaching as a sport, and people are continuing to do that, as we've heard from the folks coming from the north, and with the extinction of many of the elephants. But we certainly know that the war has taken a toll on Sudan's Southern National Park, where the team was unable to locate the buffaloes, as it's been mentioned, that were inhabited there. But that, and also only one group of elephants, as it's mentioned, when previously there were over 10,000 elephants in that region. But the rediscovery of the wildlife in Southern Sudan is fascinating, and it's definitely, we'd always look for the peace dividends. We talked about that here when the Cold War ended. Of course, we didn't get the dividends. We're still looking for those dividends, but we do see that these unexpected dividends of peace in Sudan will hopefully be able to develop the conservation, and so I think it's very important that even though we're dealing with conservation, it's going to be very critical that that the U.S. Congress and even people like yourselves, conservationists who are interested in animal life, continue to keep the pressure on our State Department, on our government, to ensure that the Comprehensive Peace Agreement is honored by the government of al-Bashir in Khartoum, because unless the Comprehensive Peace Agreement holds, then we could possibly, unfortunately, see conflict begin again, and all of the new discoveries that we're seeing now could really, we could see things revert backwards. And so I think that all of this is combined, it's tied together, the importance of keeping the pressure on, not only about South Sudan, but of course the genocide which continues to go on in Darfur is certainly a real stain on modern times here. So we look forward to working continually with the conservation organizations. We look forward to continuing to interest the USAID in becoming more engaged in cooperating with the conservation movement. We think it's certainly the right thing to do. It's right for the wildlife. It's good for the country. So we look forward to continually working with you. Once again, congratulations to all of our visitors here from South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. We're very fortunate to have a representative of the U.S. government here who literally has been a leader and has helped to fashion this whole program, because he has really been an inspiration for us in how to move forward. His name is Brian De Silva. Brian, with Senior Policy Advisor for the U.S. government in Sudan. Thank you very much, Brian. And I'm going to take a note of personal privilege. This person has never been recognized, and she is probably the most important person in the room. That is Paul Elkin's wife, Sarah Elkin. Sarah, with that, we wanted to give a moment to the government of Southern Sudan to also give their welcome. And it is my privilege to introduce General James Lauro Siricio, the Minister of the Environment, to just say a word of welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you all. We came here with the invitation from WCS. As you have heard, we have signed a memorandum of understanding. And again, we brought with us the results of the survey that they help us in surveying our livestock in Sudan. Because most of the people in Sudan and even in neighboring countries used to say that the Southern Sudan has no animals. Strangely enough, the WCS was actually helping the wildlife in Southern Sudan. So after the result of the survey, I think the whole Sudanese and even the Northerners are now convinced that there are big number of animals in the Southern Sudan. These animals used actually to be in Southern Sudan. But as you have been, as you have known, Southern Sudan was in state of war for almost 50 years. Most of these animals and most of the citizens has died. Some of the citizens took refuge, and then the animals also moved to the neighboring countries as refugees. Peace has come. Now our people are returning, and the animals are also coming. I think if Paul and Mike go back and make another survey, you will see that we have a lot of animals, because elephants has entered Sudan in 3 columns. 2 columns from Garamba, from Congo, and then the other column is from West Africa. So I am very happy to see that our brothers in America receive us, and they have seen with their own eyes, and hope that if there are some people who used to say that there is no wild animal in Southern Sudan, these are the people who want to blackmail the Southern Sudan. So I am very happy, and I have to thank you people also to come and attend this presentation. And I have come with the idea seeking for helping hand. We are seeking for helping hand so that we can train the SPLAs who has been transferred to the ministry to convert them from the tactics of the army to the tactics of guards of wildlife. We have a big number in which if we train them and then scatter them into 5 big parks and 13 reserves, the animals in Southern Sudan will feel safe. So I think I have no much to say. We have thrown the ball or a hook to the river, hoping for good Samaritans who can help us in the training of these big soldiers, number of soldiers. Well, thank you very much.